Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about Dungeons and Dragons, and we're going to talk about Dungeons and Dragons in context of Looney Tunes. Yes, that's right, Looney Tunes. So Bugs Bunny and Elmer Fudd and the Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote, right? And the reason why we're going to talk about this is what does Looney Tunes mean for Dungeons and Dragons? Well, the purpose that Looney Tunes serves in context to Dungeons and Dragons is Looney Tunes are 40 years ahead of Dungeons and Dragons, and Looney Tunes is a life brand. There are people who, when do you arrive at a life brand, right? When people are getting tattoos of you, right? By the thousands, right? There are thousands of people who have every character that I just named in Looney Tunes literally carved onto their body indelibly, right? Like, and you know, Harley Davidson is probably the most famous life brand there is, and in addition to that, there is also what else do you have? You have Dungeons and Dragons. There's like there are a lot of people who have D20s, literally Dungeons and Dragons D&D, tattooed right onto themselves. And Looney Tunes is one of these life brands. But Looney Tunes is 40 years ahead of Dungeons and Dragons in time. So Looney Tunes came out in 1930, and they are now 40 years ahead. And what we can do, so Dungeons and Dragons, D&D Sentinels like myself, somebody who is looking to protect Dungeons and Dragons and make sure it's carried forward for 3, 6, 9, 12 more centuries, right? We can look at Looney Tunes and say, okay, this brand, this life brand, this is an intellectual property just like Dungeons and Dragons. This is a life brand just like Dungeons and Dragons. This is a thing that has been carried forward and that groups are trying to continue to make relevant, right? And Dungeons and Dragons is in the same boat in that, if you're here, if you're listening to this channel, right, you care about Dungeons and Dragons more than, oh, this is a strong build, or oh, I'm going to have fun at the table, this week. You care about Dungeons and Dragons as an element of Americana. You care about Dungeons and Dragons from the perspective of what it's capable of, right? What is it, right? And so when we think about Looney Tunes, what lessons can Dungeons and Dragons learn from? Can Dungeons and Dragons Sentinels like myself, like you, what can we learn from Looney Tunes, right? Well, Looney Tunes has been around for 9 decades, and so it had the 50 years that Dungeons and Dragons had. It was 50 years old in 1980, right? And now it's 40 years past Dungeons and Dragons, and Looney Tunes is in a ton of trouble, right? It is not doing well, right? And so we can look at it and say, okay, this is an intellectual property just like our intellectual property. This is a life brand just like our life brand. So what mistakes is it making that we can avoid, right? That we can, and one of the nice things is you're like, well, how can we do anything? Well, guess what? If you ain't paying attention, holy cows. Hasbro is incredibly responsive to people who love D&D and who consider it a life brand and who are attaching it to its identity. They literally send out tons of surveys. They're constantly listening. They respond directly to YouTube videos. They respond to tweets. They are incredibly responsive, right? So if we make what we want known for the life brand of Dungeons and Dragons, it's going to happen, right? There's a lot of evidence that we are definitely being heard, right? Like, this isn't the OSR, right? We're not some confused group, right? We have this ability to communicate what we want to the guardians of Dungeons and Dragons, right? So what can we learn from Looney Tunes, and what do we want, right? So first of all, what happened to Looney Tunes? Well, one, they're highly irrelevant right now. They really do not have the cachet that they once had. Why is that? Well, one, there are some problems with their brand, and they have been with their life brand, and they have not been able to fix those problems. So first of all, what is Looney Tunes? Well, first of all, Looney Tunes is generally Bugs Bunny. It doesn't really it doesn't work without Bugs Bunny. Bugs Bunny is Looney Tunes Dritz Doerden, right? Like, he is a brand mascot, right? And when you think of Looney Tunes, you're going to think you're going to think specifically of Bugs Bunny, right? So who is Bugs Bunny? Well, one of the best descriptions I've ever heard of him is a gentleman anarchist. That is a great point, right? Like, he's mischievous, he's clever, and he's violent. He's highly violent, right? Like, Anarchy is attached to Bugs Bunny because Bugs Bunny is massively violent, right? Well, one of the issues is that violence that is attached to Looney Tunes, and it's always been there, is highly problematic now, right? One of the things is, as we've grown as a culture, Looney Tunes is an animated. One, it's an animated short. That medium doesn't even exist anymore. Like, where on earth would you go to watch an animated short, right? It's not a thing, right? Now we have shows and we have movies, right? But the reality is, Looney Tunes was never that. It was birthed as animated shorts, right? And now there isn't even a market for that, right? And in addition, Looney Tunes generally, it is connected to violence, and it is connected to this, to its major brand mascot is a gentleman anarchist, right? That's incredibly problematic, right? And one of the things is they didn't do much to fix it, right? Like, the reality is, over the years, they keep trying to just kind of repackage, Bugs Bunny and put him in front of the public, and they've never been able to manage that. This is one of the things I love about Hasbro. Hasbro is very much making Dungeons and Dragons so that it is not a repugnant, nostalgia member-berry element. It is a now, like, relevant, caught up intellectual property, right? So the OSR wants to freeze it in amber, right, and make sure that it never changes and, like, clone dinosaurs from it, right? But the reality is, Hasbro has pushed back and said, no, we refuse to let Dungeons and Dragons fall into irrelevancy because we haven't updated the language, we haven't updated the people who are being depicted in the books. We are going to change the language. We are going to make sure that that Dungeons and Dragons has its finger on the pulse of modern proclivities, right? Like, that it is now culture, right? And that's why books like Strixhaven were so important, right? And Gary Gygax started many years ago making sure that that women were represented in Dungeons and Dragons fiction, and also that people of all different skin tones, are represented. Black people, white people, Asian people, right? We that different ages are depicted, right, as adventurers. So that started with Gary, and now today it's continuing, right? And we're continuing to make sure that single people and married people, right, people of all different ages, people of different preferences, and carrying forward the work that Gary started as well, across gender, across racial divides, right? That all of this is covered, right? And so this is one of the things that, and I think, and this is something we need to really, and and Hasbro fails, right? They make significant failures in trying to make the game current and modern, right? And that the things that are depicted in Dungeons and Dragons are not out of step with where we are as a culture, right? And this is what definitely happened with the Looney Tunes. They were never able to recraft them and replace a gentleman anarchist with a different brand mascot, right? And make it relevant and make it valuable to today's viewers, right? And so this is a very powerful lesson, right? Is one, when you see Hasbro laboring, working very hard to make sure that that Dungeons and Dragons is still relevant and actually fits with American culture today, right? And is very modern, right? That is important. That is incredibly noble work, because if we don't do it and we allow there to be this continuing, if we were allow the OSR's voice to be heard in modern Dungeons and Dragons today, it would die exactly like Looney Tunes. And this is why you might have to work so hard to push back the repugnant ideas of the OSR and make sure that they are fully and thoroughly disconnected from Dungeons and Dragons. And honestly, one thing is, pretty much everything I believe was really reinforced through the Odriel controversy. The idea that the OSR has always been the most dangerous element there is, for Dungeons and Dragons since the 1980s, is we have to protect Dungeons and Dragons from the OSR. Their ideas are repugnant. Their ideas are complete member-berry nostalgia gems, and it's really, and this is the lesson from Looney Tunes, right? we must make sure that Dungeons and Dragons always stays current, right? And that the same level of Gary Gygax is pushing and saying, hey, Dungeons and Dragons is for women, Dungeons and Dragons is for black people, Dungeons and Dragons is for white people, Dungeons and Dragons is for Asian people, right? He, like, for, Latinos and Latinas, this is important, right? And this work continues today, right? And we cannot allow what has happened with Looney Tunes to happen to Dungeons and Dragons. That means that the work they are doing, and sometimes they fail, right? It's okay to fail at something. It's where you have a problem is when you're not even attempting it. And that's why the OSR, that's why their members are so repugnant and so dangerous to being connected anywhere close to Dungeons and Dragons. So make sure you are buying current today Dungeons and Dragons. Do not forget for 1 second that running D&D 1E, D&D 2E, D&D 3E, and D&D 4E, this opens the door to the Looney Tunes death, right? To the irrelevancy that Looney Tunes is dealing with right now, right? And that's what the OSR wants. They want D&D dead. We know that now because half of them were screaming D&D be gone a month ago, right? So don't let them fool you, right? The OSR is, in my humble opinion, the greatest threat to Dungeons and Dragons that exists today. Make sure you don't give them a single dollar. And no, I don't want to say that. Make sure that when you purchase your Dungeons and Dragons, you are thinking about what is going to keep Dungeons and Dragons alive, right? I'll never say OSR be gone. I want them decimated. There always needs to be that 10%, right? And reality, I don't want them gone. I want them decimated. I really want the OSR to be pushed back. Their ideas need to be kept as far away from Dungeons and Dragons as possible, right? Decimated in that I want their books to be less on the shelves, less seen than they are now, and I don't want a single concept they have, OSR, to ever be connected to Dungeons and Dragons, right? And because we need it to remain alive. It cannot die the way Looney Tunes is dying right now. Every word of that is my humble opinion. What's important is when I get to hear your humble opinion, when you get in the comments and send your traffic. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.